Hi, welcome. Today I thought I'd take a look at the Perentie Badger, the Australian built semi-automatic. And these were produced in 1994 and 1995. There weren't a huge number of them built, probably a couple hundred overall. And the reason they came about was primarily because of the ban on the importation of semi-automatic firearms, which happen to include paintball markers, because in Australia, paintball markers are also classified as firearms in most states anyway, and certainly from a federal point of view. Now, the men behind Perentie were Bruce Roberts and Darren Hayes, and the firm was based in Seville, which is east of Melbourne in the state of Victoria, Australia. Now, there were some other attempts at producing locally built semi-automatic paintball markers. There were a few prototypes made by Paintball Australia on the Gold Coast in Queensland. A couple of names come to mind, the Huntsman and the Redback, and nothing really came of them. A few were made, and I suspect nothing more than prototypes were produced. There's very little information available on the web on them, and while I've written a couple of articles on them, really there's not much to say about them that I know of at the present moment. On the Badger, however, I know a fair bit. I knew both Bruce and Darren Hayes quite well. I was sort of part of the story, you might say, and got information on these during their development and wrote a few articles on the Badger for the Australian Paintballer magazine back in the early 90s. Now, this particular Badger here that you see before you isn't a standard rental model. This one was customized by Bruce for me. So the stainless steel has been polished, the frame has been bead blasted, and the alloy on the barrel has been anodized. And Bruce also made up this rather neat leather grip. But apart from that, it really is a standard rental model Badger underneath. Now, the Badger operates on a blow-forward design and is very similar to the Automag in many respects. In fact, Bruce admits that he actually designed the Badger based upon an article he read on the Automag, though he'd never actually seen an Automag before he built this particular marker. So it's his interpretation and simplification in many respects of the Automag design. The original Badgers were designed to run on full CO2 bottle pressure. There was no regulator in the original rental models, and this one was originally running at full bottle pressure, though it now has the later model bolt in it, designed to run at lower pressure, but it was designed to run with an external regulator. I ran a Palmer's stabilizer on it to a remote bottle, and it had a stock on the back. Now, the frames of the Badgers came in two types. The early ones had these sandcast frames. Now, I actually have an ex-rental frame here. The rental guns were either powder coated in black, although there was one order powder coated in a fire engine red. And as you can see, it's got a skeleton style stock. It's relatively lightweight. So they were sandcast and then machined, and any threads here were helicoiled. The only downside of this early design was the fact that this front strap had a tendency to fracture with a lot of hard usage, which is quite typical of rental play. So it was actually replaced with a die-cast frame. Now, I have here one of the later model Badgers. This was made in December 1995, so it's a very late model. This again is probably a custom Badger, though it is powder coated in a grey rather than a black, and it has a vertical feed there, but it has the typical die-cast frame. This is much more robust, if a bit heavier than the sandcast frame of the earlier models. So next I thought I would disassemble this particular Badger and just give you an idea of what the internals look like. So I'll undo the bolts and then we'll zoom in for a closer look. So first of all, we'll take off the barrel. The barrel, as you can see, is held on with just one bolt. Now, the barrel's quite interesting. It's all glued together, so this rear stainless steel section is glued. There was a form of araldite, so this is sleeved in through here. The barrel is actually brass lined. If we look at the back, you can see the stainless steel, the anodized aluminium, and then there's a thin layer where the brass liner is. On the side here is the anti-double feed finger. It's just a piece of spring steel, very similar to an Automag one, except it's not a wire nubbin. It's actually a spring steel anti-double feed finger, which slides down that slot there. Like an Automag, all the early Badgers had the power feed style feed port. That was dropped on the later ones, and they were fitted with direct feeds like that later model marker that I showed you. Now we'll just move the barrel out of the way. The rest of the marker comes apart with just 2 bolts. There's a bolt here. If I can get the Allen key in there, oh, there it is. Before I pull the bolt assembly apart, we'll just have a look at the way the frame works. Now, as you can see, the trigger here is really quite simple. I've got a disassembled trigger here. They're actually pinned in with a roll pin, so not easy to disassemble without a pin punch. But I have this particular trigger here. As you can see, it's got a sear on the front, and the back is designed to push on the valve pin at the back here. So it's really a simplification of the Automag design. The Automag actually has a little bit more of a complex system where it's got a separate sear mechanism here with a rod that sits behind the trigger. This is simpler. Though surprisingly, the trigger pull, while a bit firmer than an Automag, is actually quite crisp and not bad to use. The actual frame itself, it has a roll pin at the back here. They discovered, even with this bolt here, they were having trouble with breakages, so that this roll pin was inserted to really keep the alignment of the internal mechanism. There's a hole here that the roll pin goes into, so that the valve mechanism can't move in relation to the sears, because as you can imagine, this relationship from here to here is actually quite critical. So I'll move this out of the way now, and we'll have a look at the valve mechanism. Now, to disassemble the valve mechanism, we just need to push against the bolt spring and just flick the actual valve pin out, very similar to an Automag valve pin. Then the rear comes out, and we've got our bolt and bolt spring, our air chamber, and at the back here we have a valve which is a couple of brass pieces and some O-rings. They're usually urethane O-rings, but you can actually use, if you're running it on compressed air, you can use nitrile O-rings. Bruce was also experimenting with different O-ring materials. At one stage he was trying Teflon O-rings, but we found that they had a tendency to deform, and you end up with quite a heavy trigger pull. Now, there was a difference between the high pressure guns and the low pressure guns in the actual bolt pin. So we'll just zoom in on the bolt and we'll have a look at that. So as you can see, that's the actual bolt pin there, and the major difference between the Badger and the Automag is that that bolt pin does not sit in the back of this air chamber, which is in the front of this bolt housing. it doesn't actually sit in an O-ring. It actually sits in a hydraulic cup seal. This particular cup seal is one of the ones for a high pressure gun. Now I've got a couple of bolts of Bruce's from some of his prototypes, so I'll just pull one of those out and show you. This particular bolt is from one of the high pressure guns, and as you can see, if we compare the two, there's a big difference in the actual bolt pin. These early high pressure bolts also had a tendency for that pin to break off because there wasn't really enough material in there between the air holes that released the air pressure into the front of the bolt area when the gun was fired, so they were a bit fragile. Bruce did address that in some of these later rental models with the high pressure design. So this one is actually a cupped one, and I've got another one here, and this one actually has a little rubber buffer that's been inserted in it. Again, that's a high pressure bolt. You'll also notice that on this particular one out of this custom gun actually has a rounded nose. Bruce actually tried a number of different designs to reduce the possibility of paint breakage, and that was one of his prototypes, which just happened to end up in this particular marker. So in reality, that's about it on the design of this particular Badger. They are really simple. Reassembly is quite straightforward. There is an O-ring here, and the larger for this one hydraulic cup seal sits down the bottom of this brass front piece. So as you can see, it just screws together. I should also point out that the original design didn't have these holes here, but Bruce discovered that high pressure air was being retained between the two bodies because that actually pushes up against the cup seal and was occasionally causing the bolt to stick. So those holes were introduced in some of the later designs. So for reassembly, it's just a matter of assembling the parts in order, reinserting it into the stainless steel body, putting the pin in, making sure that the little groove is on the upper so you can actually pull it out again next time you disassemble it. This O-ring here is used to port the air through the grip frame. This front hole here is where the air goes through to the bottom of the grip frame. So the next part of the reassembly then finally the barrel goes back on. And there's the Badger reassembled and ready to go. Like the Automag, you use a synthetic oil really for lubrication. It doesn't really need any other form of lubricant. There is one other adjustment that you actually need to do once you gas the gun up. You will find that when it's pressurized, this particular O-ring here will actually move because it's under pressure. There's a little bit of play in the aluminium valve body section, and you can actually end up with bolt stick if it's not aligned properly. And you can actually adjust where the bolt sits in relation to the barrel, up and down you might say, by adjusting the tension on this rear screw. You usually find that you have to either loosen it off or tighten it up depending on the alignment. And you can check the alignment by looking down the barrel when it's gassed. Obviously you have your mask on when you do that, and the gun shouldn't be loaded either. And you can actually see whether the bolt is aligned correctly with the rear of the chamber here. So that's all there really is to that particular Badger. Now I've got another Badger here to show you, so I'll just put this one aside and I'll get the other one out. This is a late model custom Badger, and as you can see, it's got the later model die cast frame, but in this case Bruce has put on some wooden grip panels. It's got the direct feed, and it actually uses automatic barrels, and he made a number of tournament markers for people that used automatic barrels. And this one is also fitted with a Palmer's stabilizer regulator, so the bottle could screw right on the back here. So like an automatic, nothing special with the barrel. It's a straight automatic barrel. Internally, this is exactly the same as that other marker, though it has a slightly different bolt in it. This one's got a concave bolt in it, and it's had some holes drilled in it for lightning. But it is essentially the same marker internally, and that's the other side of it. And finally, I'll just show you that late model rental. As I mentioned earlier, this has a direct feed here, but this one also has another little wrinkle. It's actually fitted with a regulator in the bottom of the grip here, and this actually uses the pin valve on a CO2 bottle as a regulator. So it's just got a piston and spring in here and a grub screw, and it actually uses the pin valve itself as the regulator valve. A bit of an innovation, but it does mean you usually have to adjust the velocity every time you screw on and off a bottle, particularly if you change to a different bottle. But apart from that, it's pretty much identical to the other two Badgers that I've shown you internally. I suppose I could have a look at the bolt. Yes, this one actually has a convex bolt in it. Again, this is not a rental one. I believe this was made as a custom gun for someone, because all the rental ones had power feeds on. I don't think any of the rentals had the direct feed, and certainly they wouldn't have had this pseudo regulator built into the grip. So that's really it for this particular video. I just thought it might be interesting to cover the Badger, and I'll probably cover again a few more markers down the track, but there's not really a huge amount of information out there on the Badger. You can find articles on the Badger and more photographs on my website, paintmagazine.com. So that's it for this particular video, and I'll catch you next time.